The loudest applause in life often comes long after the people who laughed at you have gone silent. That was a lesson few people understood on a warm Saturday afternoon at the annual Lone Star Airshow outside Fort Worth, Texas. Thousands of families filled the flight line, children waved miniature American flags, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the bright spring air as sleek fighter jets shimmered beneath the sun. Everyone had gathered to watch one man in particular. Captain Ethan Brooks was the headline attraction, a 31-year-old Air Force demonstration pilot whose flawless flying skills and confident interviews had made him a favorite on television and social media. Cameras followed him everywhere he walked, and spectators eagerly waited for selfies, signatures, and a glimpse of the confident pilot who seemed born for the spotlight. Just a few hundred feet away from the growing crowd stood another man who attracted almost no attention. 78-year-old Jack Harrison walked slowly along the display area with calm, measured steps. His faded olive-green flight jacket looked decades old. The leather had softened with age, the cuffs showed years of wear, and dozens of carefully stitched patches covered the sleeves and chest. To most visitors, it looked like nothing more than an outdated souvenir that belonged in a closet instead of an airshow. Jack never tried to explain the patches or polish the jacket until it looked new. He simply wore it with quiet dignity, carrying himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. A little girl holding her father's hand looked up at Jack with innocent curiosity. "Did you ever fly airplanes, mister?" she asked. Jack smiled warmly, the corners of his weathered face creasing gently. "A long time ago," he answered softly. "Long enough that the airplanes probably remember me better than the people do." The little girl laughed, but before she could ask another question, cheers erupted nearby as Ethan stepped onto the tarmac surrounded by photographers and event staff. Ethan noticed Jack almost immediately. His eyes paused on the old jacket, then drifted over the faded patches before a smirk crossed his face. Confident that everyone around him shared his opinion, he raised his voice just enough for nearby spectators to hear. "That jacket belongs in a museum, not at an airshow," he joked with a grin. Several people chuckled. Ethan glanced at Jack again and added, "You know, they sell brand new replica jackets in the gift shop. They even look authentic." More laughter spread through the small crowd. A few visitors exchanged uncomfortable looks, unsure whether they should laugh or remain silent. Jack never reacted. He simply adjusted the zipper on his worn jacket and continued looking toward the runway as if the words had been carried away by the wind. Ethan shrugged, satisfied that he had entertained the crowd, and walked away toward the VIP tent where reporters eagerly waited. The little girl frowned. "That wasn't very nice," she whispered to her father. Before he could answer, an elderly man wearing a Veterans Organization cap stopped walking the moment he saw Jack. His expression changed instantly. Without saying a word, he removed his cap, stood perfectly straight, and offered a respectful nod that Jack quietly returned. Nearby, one of the event security supervisors noticed the exchange, touched the radio on his shoulder, and listened carefully as an urgent message came through. His posture stiffened. His eyes widened. Then he looked directly at Jack Harrison with a respect that had not been there only seconds earlier. Jack Harrison acted as though nothing unusual had happened. He thanked the elderly veteran with a gentle smile, tucked his hands into the pockets of his weathered flight jacket, and continued strolling through the rows of aircraft displayed beneath the clear Texas sky. Children climbed into vintage cockpit exhibits with their parents, volunteers answered questions about aviation history, and loudspeakers announced upcoming demonstrations every few minutes. To everyone else, the afternoon continued exactly as planned. Yet beneath the surface, something had quietly changed. The security supervisor who had received the mysterious radio call never took his eyes off Jack for long. He spoke softly into his microphone again before stepping aside to make a brief phone call, his voice noticeably more respectful than before. Across the field, Ethan Brooks stood beneath a shaded pavilion where local television reporters surrounded him with cameras and microphones. He smiled naturally as he answered questions about precision flying, discipline, and representing the next generation of military aviation. Every sentence came easily, polished by years of interviews and public appearances. Whenever applause erupted from nearby spectators, Ethan acknowledged them with an easy wave, completely unaware that a different conversation had begun somewhere beyond the cameras. Near one of the historic aircraft displays, a retired mechanic slowly approached Jack. The man's eyes focused on the faded patches covering the old jacket before he removed his baseball cap. "Sir," he said quietly, "it has been many years." Jack recognized him after only a moment and smiled. "Tom Reynolds," he replied warmly. "I almost did not recognize you without engine grease on your hands." The two men shared a brief laugh that carried decades of friendship without revealing anything more. Tom looked as though he wanted to say something important, but Jack gently shook his head. "Let everyone enjoy the show," he said. "Today is about the young pilots." Tom nodded respectfully and walked away without another word. A nearby volunteer had witnessed the exchange and frowned with curiosity. "Who was that gentleman?" she quietly asked Tom as he passed. He smiled but simply answered, "Someone who never cared whether people knew his name." Those words lingered in her mind. Meanwhile, the little girl from earlier had not forgotten Jack either. She tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why did that man bow his head to him?" Her father glanced toward Jack and shrugged. "Sometimes respect has a story behind it that we cannot see." Not far away, another event organizer hurried toward the operations trailer carrying a clipboard. Inside, several senior officials had gathered around a table studying updated schedules. One of them answered a ringing phone. His expression immediately changed from routine concentration to complete attention. "Yes, sir," he said. "Understood. We will make the arrangements immediately." The room fell silent after he ended the call. "Everything changes," he announced calmly. "The general is on his way. Prepare the reception area, but do not make any public announcement yet." Outside, Ethan noticed unexpected movement near the operations building. Additional staff members began checking radios, adjusting barricades, and quietly speaking with uniformed personnel. He assumed they were preparing something special for the afternoon demonstration featuring his performance. With a confident smile, he straightened his flight suit and nodded toward his reflection in a nearby aircraft canopy. Across the flight line, Jack remained seated alone on a simple wooden bench facing the runway. He watched the endless blue sky with peaceful eyes, as though he had spent a lifetime listening to the language of airplanes. Around him, thousands of visitors continued enjoying the airshow without realizing that within the next few minutes, every conversation on the field would be replaced by complete and unforgettable silence. The atmosphere across the airfield slowly shifted in ways most visitors could not explain. The loud music playing through the speakers continued, children still laughed as they climbed into display aircraft, and vendors kept serving barbecue sandwiches and lemonade, yet the staff members who had seemed relaxed all morning now moved with quiet purpose. Event coordinators exchanged brief conversations over their radios before quickly walking toward the operations building. Several uniformed officers arrived in dark government vehicles and entered without attracting unnecessary attention. They greeted no reporters and ignored every camera pointed in their direction. Whatever had changed, it was clearly not part of the public schedule. Jack Harrison remained on the same wooden bench overlooking the runway. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded over the old flight jacket resting across his lap despite the warm afternoon. Every few moments he watched another aircraft taxi in the distance with the calm expression of someone who had spent countless hours studying every movement an airplane could make. The little girl from earlier spotted him again and waved enthusiastically. Jack smiled and waved back, making her grin even wider. Her father noticed that several older veterans passing nearby quietly acknowledged Jack with respectful nods. None of them interrupted him. None of them asked for photographs. It was as though they understood that some people deserved privacy more than recognition. At the VIP pavilion, Ethan Brooks continued preparing for his scheduled appearance. His crew reviewed flight details while photographers asked for additional promotional pictures beside his aircraft. Ethan enjoyed every second of the attention. He noticed the unusual activity near the operations building but dismissed it with a confident smile. Probably another visiting official coming to shake hands before the show, he joked to one of the mechanics. The mechanic looked toward the distant convoy of arriving vehicles. Maybe, he answered, although his uncertain expression suggested otherwise. Minutes later, the master of ceremonies received an updated schedule inside the announcer booth. He read the page twice before lowering it in confusion. "This is different," he whispered. "There is no explanation." The event director simply replied, "Follow the revised order exactly. We will explain later." Reporters also sensed that something unusual was happening. Several television crews quietly repositioned their cameras toward the runway instead of the demonstration area. One experienced journalist noticed senior Air Force officers gathering near the edge of the tarmac and frowned. "Nobody calls this many ranking officers together without a reason," he murmured to his producer. Even Ethan began noticing that fewer people were paying attention to him. Some visitors had turned their eyes toward the distant runway after hearing conversations spread through the crowd. Nobody knew the details, but curiosity traveled faster than any official announcement. Jack, however, remained perfectly calm. He glanced toward the horizon, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and seemed to recognize a distant sound before anyone else reacted. The noise was faint at first, almost blending with the breeze rolling across the open field. Then it grew stronger. Experienced aviation enthusiasts stopped talking. Veterans instinctively looked skyward. Children shaded their eyes with their hands. The deep, unmistakable roar of powerful engines echoed across the airfield, causing every conversation to fade into silence. Ethan slowly turned toward the runway, his confident smile disappearing as he realized no aircraft on the published program was scheduled to arrive at that moment. Far above the crowd, a sleek gray silhouette appeared against the brilliant blue Texas sky, descending with remarkable precision, and as the unmistakable shape came into view, thousands of people realized they were watching an unexpected F-22 Raptor making an unscheduled approach directly toward the airshow. The powerful aircraft descended with breathtaking precision, its sharp silhouette gliding through the bright afternoon sky before touching the runway with remarkable control. The crowd erupted into cheers, yet confusion spread just as quickly. Every visitor who had studied the official program knew this arrival had not been announced. Families pointed toward the runway while aviation enthusiasts hurried closer to the viewing barriers, eager to understand why one of the nation's most advanced fighters had appeared without warning. Television crews immediately redirected every camera away from the scheduled demonstrations. The announcer paused, glanced at the revised schedule resting beside him, and quietly lowered his microphone, realizing he had received no instructions for what was happening. The fighter rolled steadily along the runway before slowing near the center of the airfield instead of continuing toward the designated parking area. Ground crews stood ready, but none approached until they received a signal from senior officers already waiting nearby. Ethan Brooks watched with growing disbelief. He had expected to be the center of attention that afternoon, yet every eye had shifted toward the unexpected arrival. Even the reporters interviewing him only moments earlier hurried away with their cameras. Ethan forced a smile, telling himself the aircraft was probably making a ceremonial appearance before joining the scheduled program, but the uneasy feeling in his stomach continued to grow. This was not following any procedure he recognized. On the wooden bench facing the runway, Jack Harrison slowly stood to his feet. He brushed a small layer of dust from his weathered flight jacket and calmly zipped it halfway. His expression remained peaceful, almost familiar, as though he had been expecting the aircraft all along. The little girl who had spoken with him earlier noticed his movement and smiled. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging gently on her father's sleeve. "I think that airplane came for him." Her father smiled politely, assuming she was simply letting her imagination wander, but something about Jack's quiet confidence made him hesitate before answering. Around the operations building, several generals and senior officers walked toward the edge of the tarmac. None of them looked toward Ethan. None of them approached the media. Instead, every one of them positioned themselves facing the same direction. Facing Jack Harrison. The fighter finally came to a complete stop. The canopy remained closed for several long seconds while the engines gradually settled into silence. The entire airfield seemed to hold its breath. Even restless children stopped talking. Thousands of spectators stood shoulder to shoulder in complete anticipation. Then the canopy slowly lifted. The pilot climbed out with deliberate movements, descended the ladder, and removed the flight helmet. Without speaking to the welcoming officers waiting nearby, without acknowledging the cameras recording every second, and without accepting the greetings of the event organizers, the pilot immediately turned away from the aircraft. Ethan frowned in confusion as he watched the officer ignore every expected protocol. The pilot began walking across the tarmac with steady, purposeful steps. Security personnel quietly cleared a path, but not because anyone had ordered the crowd to move. People instinctively stepped aside, sensing they were witnessing something important. The pilot never looked toward the VIP pavilion. Never glanced at the reporters. Never even acknowledged Ethan Brooks. Instead, every step carried the officer directly toward the elderly man wearing the faded jacket. Ethan's confident expression disappeared completely as he realized the destination could not possibly be a coincidence. Jack remained standing exactly where he was, his hands resting comfortably at his sides, waiting with the calm patience of someone greeting an old friend rather than welcoming one of the most respected fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. Every pair of eyes followed the fighter pilot as the distance between the runway and Jack Harrison grew shorter with each measured step. The afternoon breeze gently lifted the edge of Jack's worn flight jacket, revealing more of the faded patches that had drawn so much laughter only hours before. Ethan Brooks stood frozen near the VIP pavilion, unable to understand why one of the most elite pilots in the Air Force had ignored every senior officer, every television camera, and every official greeting simply to walk toward an elderly man sitting quietly among ordinary spectators. Even the reporters lowered their voices, sensing that something far more significant than a scheduled demonstration was unfolding before them. The pilot finally stopped a few feet in front of Jack. For one long moment neither man spoke. Jack smiled with the warmth of someone recognizing a familiar tradition rather than an unexpected surprise. Then, in one smooth movement, the younger pilot stood perfectly straight, brought his right hand sharply to his forehead, and rendered a flawless military salute. A collective gasp spread across the airfield. Thousands of spectators watched in complete silence. Jack returned the salute with calm precision before lowering his hand again. The younger officer smiled respectfully. "Colonel Jack Harrison," he said clearly enough for those standing nearby to hear. "It is the greatest honor of my career to finally meet you in person." Jack chuckled softly. "I have not been called Colonel in quite a while," he replied. "Most people simply call me Jack these days." The pilot shook his head with sincere admiration. "Sir, at the academy they still teach your principles. My instructor studied under Colonel David Mercer, and Colonel Mercer always said every lesson he taught began with something he learned from you." Jack's expression softened. "David was one of the finest young officers I ever met," he answered. "I always believed he would become an exceptional leader." The pilot smiled. "He did, sir. And every pilot he trained learned your name before learning advanced tactics." Nearby, one of the event announcers quietly asked a senior officer, "Who exactly is Colonel Harrison?" The officer looked genuinely surprised by the question. "You really do not know?" he replied. "You are looking at one of the men whose work shaped generations of fighter pilots. His influence reached far beyond the aircraft he personally flew." The announcer stared at Jack with growing disbelief. Camera operators immediately zoomed in on the weather jacket. The patches that had appeared old and unimportant suddenly seemed completely different. Every stitched emblem represented years of service, innovation, and leadership that almost no one in the crowd had recognized. The little girl smiled proudly and whispered to her father, "I told you the airplane came for him." Her father nodded slowly without taking his eyes off Jack. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I think you were right." Ethan felt the weight of his own words returning to him with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered joking about the jacket belonging in a museum. He remembered the laughter from the nearby crowd. Now that same jacket had become the center of attention for an entirely different reason. No one was laughing anymore. The senior officers who had remained near the runway finally approached, but instead of taking control of the moment, they respectfully waited until the younger pilot finished speaking with Jack. Their patience alone revealed how highly they regarded the elderly veteran. The crowd sensed that an extraordinary story had only begun to unfold, and as the master of ceremonies received a new information sheet from the event director, his eyes widened before he looked toward the microphone, realizing he was about to introduce the audience to a legacy that would completely change how everyone remembered this day. The master of ceremonies took a slow breath before switching on the microphone again. His confident voice, which had introduced countless aerial performances over the years, now carried a tone of genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we have the unexpected privilege of recognizing someone whose contributions to American military aviation have quietly influenced generations of pilots." The conversations that had begun returning across the crowd immediately faded once more. Every face turned toward the elderly man wearing the weather jacket. The announcer continued carefully, reading directly from the information that had only moments earlier reached the booth. Colonel Jack Harrison served his country for decades, not only as an accomplished military pilot but also as a flight instructor, evaluator, and mentor whose work helped shape the standards followed by many of the men and women flying our nation's most advanced aircraft today. A quiet wave of surprise spread through the spectators. Many instinctively looked back toward the faded patches stitched across Jack's jacket. What had appeared to be worn decorations now represented years of extraordinary service. The younger fighter pilot standing beside Jack smiled proudly. "Sir," he said, speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "every instructor I have ever respected spoke about your discipline, your calm judgment, and your belief that character mattered more than talent. They always reminded us that a pilot earns trust long before earning applause." Jack lowered his eyes for a moment, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. "Many people carried those lessons forward," he replied humbly. "I simply had the opportunity to teach some remarkable young officers." One of the generals stepped forward with a warm smile. "Colonel Harrison," he said, "you are still being too modest." He turned toward the audience. "Many of the safety procedures, leadership principles, and training philosophies that protect our pilots today were influenced by this man and the teams he helped build. His greatest achievement was never making himself famous. It was helping countless others succeed." Applause began softly before growing stronger with every passing second. Veterans removed their caps. Parents encouraged their children to clap. Even visitors who had never heard Jack's name only minutes earlier joined the standing ovation after realizing the remarkable legacy quietly standing before them. Ethan Brooks remained motionless near the front of the crowd. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. He remembered the confidence with which he had mocked the old jacket, believing appearances revealed everything worth knowing. Now he understood that the most accomplished person on the entire airfield had never asked for recognition, never corrected anyone, and never responded with anger after being publicly embarrassed. Jack had simply remained gracious. That realization unsettled Ethan far more than public criticism ever could. The little girl smiled brightly as she looked up at her father. "He looks like a superhero," she whispered. Her father gently squeezed her shoulder. "The best heroes usually do not dress like the ones in movies," he answered. "Sometimes they wear old jackets instead." Jack quietly thanked the general and the younger pilot before glancing across the crowd. His eyes briefly met Ethan's. There was no anger in them. No satisfaction. No desire to embarrass anyone in return. Only calm understanding. That simple expression made Ethan lower his head. For the first time that afternoon, the celebrated demonstration pilot no longer felt proud of being the most recognized person at the airshow. Standing before a man whose quiet life had inspired generations without demanding attention, Ethan realized that genuine greatness was measured not by how loudly people cheered when you arrived, but by how deeply your character continued to guide others long after your own name had faded from the headlines. Ethan Brooks stood quietly while the applause continued around him. Only a short time earlier he had welcomed every cheer with effortless confidence, believing the admiration belonged to him. Now each round of applause felt different because none of it celebrated fame or flawless flying. It honored quiet service, humility, and a lifetime of leadership that had never depended on cameras or headlines. Ethan took a slow breath, removed his sunglasses, and looked once more at Jack Harrison. The old flight jacket no longer appeared faded or worn. Instead, it seemed to carry the weight of countless stories, sacrifices, and lessons that no modern uniform could fully represent. Several reporters noticed Ethan's expression changing and instinctively pointed their cameras toward him, expecting some reaction. Ethan ignored them. For perhaps the first time in his public career, he was not thinking about how he appeared on television or what headline might be written later that evening. He was thinking about the careless words he had spoken only a few hours before. Without waiting for anyone to invite him, Ethan slowly walked across the open pavement toward Jack. The crowd instinctively made room, sensing another important moment was unfolding. The younger fighter pilot who had greeted Jack first stepped aside respectfully, understanding that this conversation belonged to the two men standing before one another. Ethan stopped a few feet away. He lowered his eyes briefly before speaking in a calm, sincere voice. "Colonel Harrison," he said, "I owe you an apology." The entire crowd became silent again. Ethan continued without looking toward the cameras. "Earlier today I judged you by your jacket. I believed I understood your story without knowing anything about your life. I was arrogant, and I spoke without respect. I am truly sorry." Jack listened without interrupting. His expression never changed. There was no disappointment, no anger, and certainly no desire to make Ethan feel smaller than he already did. After a brief moment, Jack smiled gently. "Captain Brooks," he replied, "every pilot makes mistakes. The important question is whether we learn from them before they become habits." Ethan nodded slowly. "I will remember that for the rest of my life." Jack looked toward the crowd before answering. "People often think experience teaches us how to fly airplanes. Experience also teaches us how easily appearances can fool us. The finest mechanic I ever knew dressed like a farmer. One of the greatest engineers I ever worked with drove an old pickup truck until the day he retired. Character is rarely the loudest thing in the room." Several parents quietly repeated those words to their children. The little girl smiled as though she had just heard the simplest and most important lesson of the entire day. Jack continued, speaking just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Respect should never depend on medals, titles, uniforms, or expensive clothes. Respect begins the moment we choose to treat another person with dignity before we know who they are." Ethan felt those words settle deeply within him. They were not spoken as criticism. They were offered as guidance. That difference made them impossible to forget. Slowly, Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn that lesson instead of making me carry the mistake forever." Jack looked at the offered hand for only a moment before reaching forward with a warm smile and firmly shaking it. The crowd responded with another wave of applause, not because anyone had won or lost, but because they had witnessed something increasingly rare, genuine humility meeting genuine grace. Standing side by side beneath the bright Texas sky, the celebrated young pilot and the quiet veteran reminded everyone watching that the strongest people are often the first to admit when they are wrong and the wisest people are often the quickest to forgive. As the applause gradually settled, the senior general stepped forward once again with a thoughtful smile. He looked first at Jack Harrison, then at Ethan Brooks, before turning toward the thousands of spectators gathered along the flight line. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today you expected to witness remarkable flying. Instead, you have witnessed something even more important. You have seen the values that make remarkable pilots possible." His words were met with quiet nods throughout the audience. Veterans stood proudly beside young families. Children who had arrived hoping only to see fast airplanes now watched with complete attention as history unfolded before them. The younger F-22 pilot turned toward Jack once more. "Sir," he said respectfully, "there is one more honor I have been authorized to request." Jack raised an eyebrow with a gentle smile. "Go ahead, son." The pilot took one step backward before standing perfectly straight again. His right hand rose sharply into a crisp military salute. Almost instantly, every uniformed member of the Air Force standing nearby followed his example. Officers, enlisted personnel, instructors, and cadets all came to attention together. Their synchronized salute reflected years of discipline, but on this afternoon it carried something far more personal. It was not simply a military tradition. It was an expression of gratitude from one generation to another. Ethan watched the formation for only a brief second before taking his own position. He stood as straight as he ever had during any ceremony, lifted his hand with complete precision, and rendered the most meaningful salute of his career. This time there was no audience to impress, no television interview to prepare for, and no desire for recognition. There was only respect. Jack looked across the line of saluting men and women. For a brief moment his eyes glistened with emotion, though his smile never faded. He slowly returned the salute, holding it with quiet dignity before lowering his hand once again. The crowd responded instinctively. Thousands of spectators rose to their feet. Veterans removed their caps. Parents placed hands over their hearts while many children simply applauded as loudly as they could without fully understanding why the moment felt so important. The little girl who had first spoken with Jack earlier in the day smiled brightly and waved both hands. Jack noticed her immediately and gave her a small wave in return, making her laugh with delight. The master of ceremonies quietly stepped away from the microphone, recognizing that no words could improve what everyone was already witnessing. Even the television reporters stopped speaking into their cameras. Instead of narrating the event, they simply allowed the images to tell the story for themselves. After several respectful moments, the younger F-22 pilot lowered his salute and walked back toward the aircraft. Before climbing the ladder, he turned once more toward Jack and nodded deeply. Jack answered with the same calm smile that had remained unchanged throughout the entire afternoon. The engines slowly came to life again, their familiar roar echoing across the Texas sky. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, many spectators continued watching Jack instead of the fighter. Ethan noticed that simple fact and quietly smiled to himself. Earlier that day he would have measured success by who received the loudest applause. Now he understood that the greatest honor was earning the lasting respect of others through humility, integrity, and service. When the fighter lifted gracefully into the brilliant blue sky and disappeared above the clouds, the crowd erupted into cheers once more, yet many people knew the memory they would carry home was not the breathtaking flight they had just witnessed, but the quiet veteran in the worn jacket who reminded an entire airshow that true greatness never needs to announce itself. Long after the fighter disappeared into the clear Texas sky, the emotion of the afternoon remained with everyone standing along the flight line. Conversations slowly returned, but they sounded different now. Instead of discussing speed, altitude, or aerial maneuvers, families spoke quietly about respect, humility, and the remarkable veteran whose greatest accomplishments had remained hidden beneath a weathered jacket. Reporters who had planned to feature dramatic footage of modern aircraft completely changed the focus of their stories. Cameramen replayed the moment of the salute again and again, realizing they had captured something far more meaningful than an unexpected landing. Parents knelt beside their children to explain why every soldier, pilot, and officer had honored Jack Harrison with such sincere admiration. The little girl who had first asked whether Jack had ever flown an airplane walked over with her father one last time before leaving the airshow. She looked up at Jack with bright, hopeful eyes. "Mr. Jack?" she asked softly. "Do you think someone like me could become a pilot someday?" Jack smiled, with the same kindness that had never left his face throughout the entire day. "Of course you can," he answered. "Learn something new every day, work harder than people expect, and never believe that wearing a uniform makes someone more important than anyone else. Character always flies higher than an airplane." The little girl hugged her father and promised she would remember those words forever. Ethan Brooks quietly waited until the crowd around Jack had begun to thin before approaching once more. This time there were no cameras nearby and no reporters listening. "Sir," he said honestly, "today changed me more than any flight I have ever completed." Jack smiled. Then today was a good day for both of us. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. From now on, before every demonstration, I am going to remind myself that people are watching more than my flying. They are watching how I treat others. Jack gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. If you remember that lesson, you will become the kind of pilot people admire long after they forget your awards. Those words remained with Ethan as they shook hands one final time. Before leaving the airfield, Jack quietly picked up the small folding chair he had carried with him that morning and slipped his hands into the pockets of his old flight jacket. He declined interviews, politely thanked the event organizers, and refused every special escort offered by the senior officers. He walked toward the parking area exactly as he had arrived, unnoticed by many people who had never realized greatness had been sitting beside them for hours. Yet those who did recognize him watched silently until he disappeared from view. Weeks later, a framed photograph of the unforgettable salute hung inside the Airshow Museum alongside a simple plaque describing the moment when one generation honored another. Visitors often paused longer at that photograph than at any aircraft display nearby. Ethan returned to future airshows with the same remarkable flying skills, but people close to him noticed a quiet change. He greeted mechanics before interviews, thanked volunteers by name, spent extra time encouraging young visitors, and never again judged someone by outward appearance. Whenever new pilots asked him about the most valuable lesson he had learned during his career, he never talked about advanced aircraft or difficult maneuvers. Instead, he smiled and said that the greatest lesson came from an elderly man wearing an old jacket who proved that true honor is never stitched onto fabric or measured by applause. It is earned through a lifetime of integrity, carried with humility, and recognized by those wise enough to look beyond appearances.